Okay, well, welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight for our program, Looking Back at Boston TV, the programs and personalities we love to watch. My name is Helen Liu, and I'm the Programming and Partnerships Manager at Cary Library. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the Cary Library Foundation. Their support enables us to bring programs like tonight's event to you. This program will be recorded and posted to the library's YouTube channel. If you have any questions, please enter them into the Q&A. Now I'd like to introduce our guest. Donna Halper is a former broadcaster who spent nearly 4 decades in radio. A widely quoted media historian, she is the author of 6 books and many articles. Among her areas of expertise are the history of broadcasting, the history of baseball, and the history of rock and roll. She is credited with discovering the classic rock band Rush, who dedicated 2 albums to her. A professor of communication and media studies at Lesley University in Cambridge, Mass., Dr. Halper was a 2023 inductee into the Massachusetts Broadcasters Hall of Fame. Welcome, Donna.
What a pleasure to be here. Seriously, this is just amazing. I've wanted to do this for ages. So welcome to my messy office. And Baby Yoda says hello. And so do the guys in Rush. And we're going to have some fun. And we're going to talk about something that has influenced all of us, namely television. Now, I don't know about you, but some of you may remember when you got the TV guide. It used to come to your house. It looked like this. There's good old Perry Como on the cover. And some of you, if you lived in the area, you may also remember that there was a local publication and it was called Television Week. And there's Gus Saunders. Remember Gus Saunders? We'll talk about him sometime when I'm doing a talk about radio. But Gus ended up doing a TV show, The Yankee Kitchen. And one other television memory that I have. Do any of you remember seeing the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show? I do. And you want to talk about something that changed my life? That was absolutely something. So let's see if this works. And let's see if it does what I want it to do. And if it does, I will be a happy person, because technology being as it is, there we go. So back in the old days, when television was brand new, you spent a lot of time with this. This is a test pattern. Now, this one is from Channel 4, but every station had one because television wasn't on 24 hours a day. We take all that for granted today. It's like, oh, television, 57 channels and nothing on. Today it's 500 and something channels plus streaming and nothing on. But back then, you had basically 2 if you lived in Massachusetts and 1 if you lived in Rhode Island. But before I even start, I've got to do something that I can only do for a Lexington audience. That's Carl Wheeler. Maybe you know him, maybe you don't. And no, that picture is not expanded. He was a big guy. Carl Wheeler was 6'5". He weighed close to 300 pounds. And when he was younger, he really wanted to be a pro wrestler. In fact, he wrestled in high school. He was pretty good at it. He also loved singing. He had quite a good tenor voice. And the other thing he loved, he fell in love with a new technology called radio. Now, I know what you're thinking. Donna, this isn't a talk about radio. You're right, it's not. But Carl Wheeler really embraced the new technology. Carl lived in Lexington all the days of his life. His father was quite successful. His father, Harvey, was a successful businessman. Lived at 265 Lowell Street, which I think is in East Lexington, if my memory serves. Quite the mansion. Did real well. And Harvey was a businessman. He wanted his son to join the family business, but Carl loved the new technology. He loved radio. And then he read about this new thing called television, and he decided he loved that too. And in 1927, as some of you may know if you've read some of my work, there was a radio station in Lexington. Oh, yes, there was. WLEX. It originally operated out of Carl and his wife Virginia's house, 13 Pelham Road. Needless to say, Virginia was not amused at having a radio station in the living room. She kind of told Carl, hey, move that radio station out. So they did. And Carl and his friend Jerry Harrison and his friend Jack Dodge, they moved it out to a 22-room mansion, must be nice, at the corner of North and Adams Streets, right on the Burlington-Lexington line. And that's where they put the studios of WLEX, Lexington's first radio station, and soon it was where they would operate Lexington's and one of the United States' first television stations. This is Jerry Harrison. I don't know who's on this webinar, but some of you may know a guy named Stan Harrison. That's Jerry's son. And Stan Harrison very kindly shared some rare photographs with me, including this one. Notice the old WLEX microphone. This is what microphones look like back in the late 20s, okay? And WLEX, the voice of the Minuteman. And Jerry was one of the co-owners of the station. He did the announcing. He also loved to do sportscasting. He broadcast all kinds of local sports. And he ran the station and did some of its publicity along with Carl, okay? And Jerry really becomes a guy who stays in radio. Carl goes on to other things. Jerry does not. Jerry stays in radio all the days of his life. He becomes the station manager of WLLH in Lowell, okay? And I just thought I would mention that because, like I said, Carl and Jerry and their friend Jack Dodge and a couple of other people read about this new thing called television. This is a headline from the Boston Post. The Boston Post puts in this news item that television is coming soon. Now, television wasn't really coming soon, not like we know it, okay? These were experiments, but they were some of the first in New England and some of the first in the United States. Today, long forgotten, but they actually did put a station on the air. It was called 1XAY. The X stood for experimental, okay? 1XAY, later W1XAY. Here's the engineer who put it on the air, a guy by the name of Al Pote. Some of you may remember the old WMEX. He was their chief engineer and later their station manager. So everybody kind of knew everybody. Today, those early experiments have long since been forgotten. W1XAY stayed on the air off and on from the middle of 1928 till the end of 1929. The quality of the pictures, and not a lot of people had the transmitting equipment. It was mechanical television. It used a scanning disc. It was noisy. But again, the fact is, without these folks, without Carl Wheeler, without Jerry Harrison, without Al Pote, I could not tell this story. So I thought I would give them a little shout out and say thank you. Now, what we know today as modern television, very different from the experimental stuff of the late 20s and early 30s, the very, very first television station to go on the air was in Boston. It was WBZ, the Westinghouse station. Let me get myself out of the way here so you can see this. Okay, couple of fun facts. The test pattern went on the air on May 29th, 1948, but the station wasn't built yet. Poor Arch McDonald. Arch McDonald was a radio guy, and he kind of got roped into doing the first television broadcast on June 9th of 1948, except they're still building the station. They're building it all around him. You can sort of hear them hammering and putting in nails. He sort of sat on a keg of nails and stuff, like a big keg, and he did the broadcast. I believe the first thing he ever said was, "We're on the air." And they were. But they were building it all around him because there were endless delays putting the station on the air. In early 1948, only about 100 people had a TV set. But by the late 1948 season, when they were kind of doing the Christmas like ads in the newspaper, pretty soon, everybody wants to buy a TV set. 37,000 televisions are sold. By 1952, 1 million people in Greater Boston have television. So like I said, WBZ, Channel 4, first station to go on the air. WNAC-TV, Channel 7, goes on the air June 21st of 1948. And that's it. There's just those two stations until May of 1955, when you get an educational station, WGBH. The first sponsor of a program, National Shawmut Bank. And of course, Arch McDonald, that was his sponsor for the news. And like I said, the next Boston TV station after that, WHDH-TV, Channel 5, November 26, 1957. Here's Arch McDonald on the air at WBZ. And he would go on to a long career as a news broadcaster, widely respected, widely admired. But at first, nobody knows what to do with television. Like, what is this thing? Everyone says I should have one. There's all these ads in the newspaper. Not a lot of things on, mostly the test pattern and maybe 1 hour of TV a day. During the pennant race in 1948, you got the Boston Braves. They're playing against the Cleveland Indians. It's very exciting. Somebody gets the bright idea. Why don't we put TV receivers on the Boston Common, and people can come in and see for themselves all this cool stuff about this new technology called television. And this rare photograph shows people on October 6, 1948, both men and women, coming down to the Boston Common, watching the World Series. Now, again, to us today, the quality of the pictures, not so great. But to people who had never had anything like this before, I mean, people have been talking about visual radio, radio with pictures. They've been talking about it for years. But this was the best you were going to get at the time, and people were pretty amazed. And here's a little bit of how the sausage gets made. Here's some folks from WNAC television. They're way up in the stands. They're looking down. There's your cameras looking down, and they're kind of checking out the scene. A lot of people start watching television because it gives them sports broadcasts. For people that can't afford to go to the games, it's kind of nice to have the games come to you. Now, what happens? What happens is that a lot of folks that had been on radio make the transition over to television almost immediately. Here we have Hum and Strum. Tom Currier, Max Zides, they had been performing on Boston radio since 1924. They migrated over to television. They got their own show. So did a lot of local performers. Here we have Louise Morgan. Louise Morgan was another person who had come from Boston radio, becomes very popular on Boston television. In fact, she's known for good reason as the first lady of Boston television. She had her own show in 1949. It was called Shopping Views. But she also became a celebrity interviewer. She had all kinds of interesting people on the air. And a lot of people bought television sets because they wanted to hear the performers singing. They wanted to watch the sports. Like I said, pretty soon you go from 37,000 TV sets to well over 1 million. And the TV audience is growing. So are the number of hours the TV is on the air. At first, you're real lucky if you get an hour a night. Then it's 2, then it's 3, etc., and etc. Now, here's a guy who has been forgotten, and he probably shouldn't be. This is Gene Jones. Some of you may remember a show that was on the air for years, a show called Community Auditions. Community Auditions was sponsored by Community Opticians. In fact, that's why they jokingly named it Community Auditions. Community Opticians sold eyeglasses. And they figured, hey, what's a nice way to get people to think about buying some eyeglasses? Let's give them a fun program that they'll enjoy watching. And so they settled on a talent show. We still have them today, like, America's Got Talent and stuff like that, The Voice, etc. The precursor to a lot of those, Community Auditions. Gene Jones was a big band singer. He also had his own orchestra. He did hosting. He did voiceover. He did commercials, widely known in Boston. Everybody knew his voice. And they made him the first host of Community Auditions. The show was wildly successful. In fact, he stayed on as the host until February of 1967, when it was taken over by Dave Maynard. A lot of people remember Dave Maynard hosting Community Auditions, but Gene Jones did it first. Now, here's another early show that was very popular. It's a show called Starring the Editors. And those 4 guys are from the major Boston newspapers, the Herald, the Post, the Globe, and the Christian Science Monitor. And once a week, in that era before the internet, when long distance calls were really, really expensive, Starring the Editors gave the public a chance to ask the editors about news coverage. Why did you cover this? How come you didn't cover that? How come you said this about that person? And they answered these questions. The show ran for years. It was very, very popular. Today, I'd kind of like to see something like that come back. Have you ever wondered, how come this is a big story, but something else is just as important and nobody's covering it? Well, that's what Starring the Editors did for the audience. It gave them access that they had never had before. But it wasn't all serious. There were a lot of network programs by that time, NBC, CBS, ABC. All the affiliations brought you national stars. Of course, Groucho Marx with You Bet Your Life. Remember, say the secret word and the duck will fly down? He was extremely popular with the national audience. And here's somebody else you may remember. Remember Dinah Shore? See the USA in your Chevrolet. Oh, Donna, don't sing. But everybody was singing along. Dinah Shore's jingle became really popular, but Dinah Shore was already popular. She was a vocalist from the 1940s, from the big band era. She had been on with Eddie Cantor on radio. Everybody loved Dinah Shore. And when she started hosting the Dinah Shore Show, she made that See the USA in Your Chevrolet song, which goes back to 1949 and no one cared. But then she started singing it, and suddenly everybody's buying Chevrolets. My father had a Chevrolet, but I got a Chevrolet myself. The reality of the situation, though, is in those early days on TV, even the jingles became popular. You know what else became popular? Children's programming. Don't forget, this is the era of the baby boom. The war's over. All the servicemen that came home wanted to marry and have families. If it were not for that, I would not be here doing this talk because my father, God rest his soul, was in the Army. And when he came home, he and my mother settled down. They had 2 kids. And when you got kids in that era, you want them to watch something. And educational programming became a very big deal. Okay. Big Brother Bob Emery, who we'll talk about, had a children's program on television. But Miss Francis had the national show, Ding Dong School, starting in 1953. Very, very popular. Okay. Also popular, a local host, Eileen Nealand, the lady of the bookshelf. She'd read a story, and then she had an artist in the background, like sketching it out for people. It was just an incredibly creative program. People really enjoyed watching it. That adults watched it along with the kids because the artist was so talented. Okay. Eileen Nealand was around for years. Her artist was a guy named Ted Miller, very famous illustrator. He worked for some of the newspapers. She later became a professor at Endicott College for many years. And here's my guy. Here's who I remember growing up watching. Big Brother Bob Emery. And he had his own TV show, but he came from radio. He had been on the radio as far back as, wait for it, 1921. He was on the air for decades, first on radio, then on television. And by the way, it is a myth. And if you read half the stuff online, it isn't true. There's myths about children's show hosts that, oh, he said into an open microphone, that ought to hold the little. I never said it, didn't happen, wasn't true. The joke was that supposedly children's show hosts hated kids. Not true at all. I know a lot of kids. They're grown-ups now, but I know a lot of kids who were on the Big Brother show. They sat in the audience. He was nice to the kids. He liked the kids. Now, agreed, sometimes kids could be annoying, but by and large, he really did enjoy doing the Big Brother Club, which was on for decades until he finally retired in 1968. Speaking of people you may remember who had children's shows that even the grown-ups watched, Rex Traylor. Rex Traylor, who later went on to become a professor at Emerson, and I worked with him. What a nice man. I'm serious. Did all his own tricks, taught himself how to do the whole lasso thing. He could rope, he could ride. What a nice guy. He did a show called Boomtown. It debuted in 1956, very popular program. So this really was the era when the grown-ups had stuff to watch at night and the kids had stuff to watch in the morning or in the afternoon, and it worked out for everybody. Now, here's one of my earliest childhood memories. Hurricane Carol blew through Massachusetts in August, late August of 1954. The power was off for days. And the WBZ-TV tower got hit. The wind was so fierce, it knocked down part of the tower. Poor Jack Chase, he's on the air at the time. The tower, 649 feet, comes crashing down. This is all that's left, okay? And the tower just missed the newsroom. It hit a couple of cars. Thank God nobody was hurt. And they stayed on the air. I think they were only off the air for about a minute before the auxiliary kicked in. But no kidding, that was the era when you lived on your transistor radio because that's the only way you could hear anything during the hurricane. And the TV stations kept New England informed, even though the hurricane knocked down a large part of the TV tower. Now, this was one of the most beloved television broadcasters. This is Jack Chase. What a nice man. Jack Chase, I keep saying that, but it's true. There were some really nice people. I come from radio, okay? I spent 4 decades in radio mostly, but I did get to meet some of these folks, and they really were as advertised. Yeah, there were a few that were divas, but by and large, nice folks. Jack Chase was a military veteran. He came to WBZ from Des Moines, Iowa. He was a naval pilot during the war, just very distinguished. Joined WBZ Radio, then joined WBZ-TV. Every day, he would do a toast to his audience. And some of you that are Big Brother fans may remember that Big Brother also did a toast. Toasts were a big deal back then. And I don't mean like toast and marmalade. I mean like toasting the audience. And they did, because they were just happy to be there. They were at the beginning of a new technology, and television was starting to create local stars. Now here we have Bozo the Clown, really Frank Avrush. And again, just like the stories about Big Brother, the stories about Bozo, also false. Frank Avrush played Bozo the Clown on TV from 1959 to 1970. Sometimes his sidekick was Judy Valentine. Judy just passed about a year ago. She was a very popular vocalist, just a wonderful lady. But Frank Avrush also was a booth announcer. He announced the movies on WHDH, WHDH TV back then. It's Channel 5 today. And all of these folks are there at the beginning, and they're trying to create something. And the public really bonded with Bozo. Every market had one. It was a licensed name. Every city had a Bozo the Clown, and Frank Avrush did it as well as anybody. Now here's somebody else that was licensed out. Miss Jean. Every city had a Miss Jean, Miss Sally, Miss Fran, Miss Betty, because the name was licensed. Ours was Miss Jean. Her real name was Jean Mary Dallaire. And for a time, she was married to newsman Bill Harrington. Okay, they ultimately got divorced. But she was a teacher, and she became the host of Romper Room. Some of you may remember Romper Room. Romper, Bumper, Stomper, Boo. And there were all of these little local programs that became so popular. Now, Miss Jean did that show for quite a while. And then ultimately she went on to the next thing. She and Bill Harrington got divorced. She remarried a guy named Alan Bruce Durkee, who was the former CEO of the company that made Marshmallow Fluff. And Miss Jean just died recently. She died in May of this year. She was 90 years old. But for a generation of baby boomers, they remember growing up with Romper Room. Now, another thing that was real popular on Boston television for reasons that no one could figure out, Candlepin Bowling. Only in New England was Candlepin Bowling a big deal. I tell my friends about Candlepin, they look at me funny if they come from other states, because Candlepin is kind of a New England thing. It's actually kind of a Boston thing. Every place else, it's the big balls, or in Baltimore, it's the duck pins. But here, you got your Candlepin, and you could win big prizes. I mean, these guys were like, this is a very rare photo from 1960, August of 1960. And the two of them, Joe Kalina and Don Williams, they're in the Channel 5 Bowl-a-thon. And Kalina won. He won $1,000. And here we have Don Gillis, who is normally a sportscaster, but he hosted Candlepin Bowling along with Jim Britt for years. Now, I told you earlier, one of the big things that everybody loved back then was watching sports. Now, many people remember Ted Williams for being famously cranky, but when it came to kids, and when it came to his efforts on behalf of the Jimmy Fund, absolutely tireless. There were very few baseball players who raised more money for a charity than Ted Williams did for the Jimmy Fund. Now, of course, the original Jimmy was a guy named Carl Einar Gustafson, who was from Maine. He came to Boston for treatment, and he actually did beat cancer, lived into his mid-60s, if I'm not mistaken. But Ted Williams, in those early days of the Jimmy Fund, he just kind of took it on, because originally it had been a Boston Braves charity. And then when the Braves moved, the Red Sox took it on. And I think people were surprised at how Ted Williams got behind it. But he did. Now, sportscasting becomes an art form in Boston, to the point where some people are going to the game, but they're bringing their transistor radio with them so that they can hear the folks calling the play-by-play while they're watching the game. Here's Kurt Gowdy. Kurt Gowdy had been on the air here. He came from Oklahoma, okay? And he'd been on the air in Boston since the 50s. This is before he goes on to the network and becomes very popular. Back then, he's still on WGBH-TV, along with Ned Martin and Mel Parnell. And Mel, of course, was a former player. And they did the play-by-play in the mid-60s. Everybody loved it. Ned Martin goes on to a long career in radio, too. To this day, a lot of the folks that started in radio went over to TV, but also kept their ties to radio. And they became very adept at painting a picture with words. Meanwhile, the technical quality has improved. The early days of watching sports on TV, not very good, but by the 60s, really good. Okay. And where a lot of folks were worried that, oh my God, people won't go to the games anymore. Yeah, they did. They still went to the games, particularly if the Red Sox were winning. But in some cases, even when they weren't, they went just for the experience. Now, here we have, remember I told you WGBH went on the air in the 50s. And one great gift that WGBH gave us, Julia Child. Julia Child never planned to be a chef. In fact, her program was just almost kind of like a one-off. She first started off with this thing called The French Chef. It was a summer replacement in 1962, in July. She was amazed by how many people loved it. They loved it so much that they asked her to come back and do a regular show. And so it was. Now, she had been in Paris with her husband, who was a diplomat, and she took a course in French cooking, and ultimately, she gets a full-time show on Channel 2. It gets syndicated. Everyone loved The French Chef, really popularized French cooking, thanks to Channel 2 in Boston. Now, here's somebody that I dearly loved. This is Don Kent, okay? And some of you may remember Don Kent. Don Kent, like many people, got his start in radio, one of the best-known television meteorologists out there. But he got his start listening to a radio guy named E.B. Rideout. The E stood for Edward. He didn't like the name, so he always went by E.B. And Don Kent grew up listening to radio meteorologists, radio weathermen. And he decided, like, hey, this is a cool career. And so it was that he went on the air first as the weather bee, but eventually as Don Kent. He was on the air on Channel 4 for decades. Everybody loved the guy. Died in 2010 at the age of 92. People still have fond memories of Don Kent. Now, speaking of fond memories, this is Shelby Scott. Shelby Scott came to Channel 4 from Seattle in late 1965. She covered the news. She did some anchoring. In fact, in 1977, she became one of the first all-female anchor teams. She and Gail Harris, 1977, they ultimately were pushed out because somebody in the programming division thought that Shelby was too old. She was like 40 at the time. But that's where people were back then. Shelby never forgot it. She was annoyed about it till the day she died. But Shelby had a long career. You may remember Shelby because of her hats. She became very known for doing the weather. And if it was like a really snowy day and it was going to be a blizzard, she would wear a red hat during her stand-up. Okay, she'd be outside. Oh my God, Shelby's got the red hat on. If it was a blue hat, well, you could go out, but be careful, and people really started identifying her for the hats. She wanted them to remember her for her ability to cover the news. And she really was very good at what she did. She just passed last year in June at the age of 86, one of the first women news reporters in Boston, who was not just restricted to like Louise Morgan could have covered news, but they basically wanted her to cover like recipes and society and celebrities. Nothing wrong with that. But it really isn't until the 60s that we start seeing women covering actual like hard news, like politicians and current events. And Shelby Scott was one of the good ones. Now, here's somebody that I miss to this very day. I was in college when he was on the air, but I still thought he was incredibly cool. Major Mudd. His real name was Ed McDonald. He was on WNAC-TV. The kids loved him, but this was another one of those shows where the parents did too, because he would always do stuff that was going to go right over the heads of the kids, and the parents got it, and so did a lot of us college students. Major Mudd, he created that character, played it from 1961 to 1974. He died very young from something that today is totally treatable, diabetes. But back then, there just weren't a lot of good treatments. And like I said, he died young. And there's a lot of people that felt terrible about it, including me. I couldn't believe it. I loved his show, Major Mudd. Now, over on Channel 2, one of the first and best known African-American female reporters, Sarah Ann Shaw. She gets her start on Channel 2 on a show called Say Brother. And then she comes over to WBZ in October of 1969, tasked with mainly covering the Black community. But she went well beyond that, okay? She started covering all kinds of news with respect to the poor, with respect to the housing crisis, corruption. She won a ton of awards, but she was one of the earliest and one of the best known Black female broadcasters in Greater Boston on television. Now, let's do a few fun facts, if I might. Here's a few fun facts about WHDH. Remember, I kind of confused a few things before, and there's very good reason, okay? WHDH was originally a radio station. It gets purchased by the Herald Traveler. It becomes a TV station, and it becomes known for baseball. Then it becomes known for bowling, and then it loses its license after a long battle. And the new owners, WCVB Channel 5, which went on the air in mid-March of 1972, still there. Now, some of you may remember Chet Curtis. Chet and Natalie became the two most popular, next to Jack and Liz, anchor teams in Boston. Chet was a gentleman. I believe his real name was Chester Kukovitz. I could be saying that wrong, but Chet Curtis and Natalie Jacobson, they were married for a while. They met on, at the station. They fell in love. They got married. They were co-anchors. After their divorce, he went over to NECN. He was later inducted into the Massachusetts Broadcasters Hall of Fame, widely popular newsman. And Chet and Nat, oh my God, was there ever a more popular team than Chet and Nat? Like I said, unless it was Jack and Liz, and we'll talk about them in a minute. Now here's Mike Lynch, very popular sportscaster. I like Mike. I like Mike a lot. I just saw Mike a couple of months ago. He and I just got inducted into the Massachusetts Broadcasters Hall of Fame, same time, in June of this year. Big honor. Mike was a college football star. He once kicked a game-winning field goal to give Harvard the Ivy League championship. Very popular sports broadcaster on channel, about 37-year career. And that other popular team, Jack and Liz. Now, these are two people that I did know, okay? Both still around. Two of the nicest human beings. What you saw was what you got, okay? Just down to earth, very kind. Liz came here from Little Rock, Arkansas in 1980. There was a question about how would the market accept a Black female anchor? Not a problem. People adored her, and they adored Jack. And Jack and Liz and Chet and Nat fought it out in the ratings for years. And Liz, ultimately, to everyone's surprise, left television to become a minister of the gospel. She was a minister in Roxbury. She just retired fairly recently. It was last I heard she was writing a book, very involved in social justice. Jack is still around, still raising money for charity. You may remember his charity, Wednesday's Child, that helped kids get adopted. Now, remember earlier I talked about Gene Jones? Gene Jones was, of course, the first host of community auditions. The second one, Dave Maynard. Dave got his start on radio. He was a graduate of Emerson College, 1951, and then he went over to a couple of local stations, and then he latched on to WBZ in 1958, and then ultimately he took over in February of 1967 and became the host of community auditions, kept hosting it till 1978. And if you live in Lexington, or if you live in the area, you may remember that they had auditions at local theaters, at local malls. You could come out and try your luck. Maybe you'd get on the show. It was, like I said, the precursor to America's Got Talent, okay? Dave passed in 2012, was 82 years old. Now, some of you may remember John Dennis and Tom Ellis, two other people who had really long careers on Boston television. John was a sports guy, later became a sports talk guy over on radio. Tom Ellis pretty much stayed on television. He also had done radio, but there weren't too many stations that Tom Ellis didn't work at. In this rare photo, they're covering the Boston Marathon in 1984. But if it existed and if it was on the radio or on television, it's a really good chance that you heard and saw John Dennis and Tom Ellis covering it, mostly for Channel 7, but for other stations as well. And some of you may also remember Janet Langhard, very glamorous. She was a former model, and she went on to television. September of 1973, she came to Channel 5. She hosted their morning show, Good Day. Then she went to New York. She came back to Boston. She anchored off and on until 1987. Had a very long and very successful career on Boston television, interviewing celebrities and talking about what was going on in the community. And here's somebody that everyone loves. This is Jorge Quiroga. He joined Channel 5 in 1974 to produce Spanish language programming. And then he became a news reporter in 1977. He was the first Latino reporter in Boston that we know about who did anything on any major station, had a long career at Channel 5, 40 years before he finally retired in 2018. Just got a couple more. I hope I'm not being boring. Remember Artie Saul? I always loved Artie Saul. He was always amazed that he became so popular on TV because he always said he didn't think he had much of a face for television. I thought he was adorable. He was just so down to earth. Raleigh David Saul, Artie Saul. He joined Channel 7 in 1983. He won numerous awards, remained at Channel 7 till 1997, went over to NECN till 2011, and then became a teacher of broadcasting. And speaking of meteorologists with long careers, Harvey Leonard. Harvey was on the air on Boston television for 5 decades, one of the most knowledgeable meteorologists, very educated, had a master's degree from NYU, in meteorology. Joined Channel 5 in 2002. He'd been with WHDH-TV before that. Just retired fairly recently, May 2022. Now, let me close with some people that some of you, I am sure, remember. In mid-May of 2018, WBZ-TV kind of got the band back together for their 70th anniversary. They reunited that really, really popular evening news team with Bruce Schwegler, Joyce Kulhawick, Jack Williams, Liz Walker, and Bob Lobel. Bob Lobel, still around. He's had a whole bunch of health problems, God bless him, but he's still around. Just saw him a couple of months ago. Liz, as I said, was a pastor for a number of years. Jack, still around raising money for charity. Joyce has her own website, does a whole bunch of guest appearances, and Bruce passed away in early August of 2022. Now, I could go on indefinitely, but the reality is there are so many people that were on the air on Boston television who changed our lives, who brought us to the event in real time, who made us feel like they knew us and we knew them, who did reporting from the neighborhoods, who were live, who were local, who were personalities. Boston is very fortunate. We have some absolutely amazing personalities who are still on the air. There are hardworking reporters out there day and night trying to keep us informed. There are also people who are entertaining us, who are giving us sports, who are giving us weather, who are trying their best to be people worthy of our time and worthy of our trust. I gotta admit, my heart's in radio, but I feel very grateful to be in a city and to be in a region that has such wonderful television as we do. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions? Feel free to put it into chat or Q&A.
But if there's somebody that you want to know more about, I am frequently on the air on WBZ Radio with Morgan White, and we talk about whatever the listeners want us to talk about. And also, if you ever think of something that you're curious about, like whatever happened to this one or whatever happened to that one, please, I am very willing to get in touch. You can get in touch with me and I will get back to you. Happy to do it. My email is DLH, which is my initials, Donna Lee Halper, DLH at donnahalper.com. And if you send me your question, I will try my level best to answer it. Thank you for being interested in our history, because these are people who contributed to us. They made us happy. Sometimes they made us angry. Sometimes they made us frustrated. Don't you love it when the weather is wrong? You know, they tell you to bring an umbrella and it's like a bright sunny day. But they were people that we knew who came into our homes every night, and they still are. And I just love doing this kind of stuff. And thank you so much for letting me do it.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us. Have a good night.